In this video, another book draws near. Let's gain some experience points by taking on Bitmap Books' biggest book. Hi everyone, John here. Today we're taking a look at another epic book, and though we shouldn't overuse the word epic, it is fitting here, as this is over 370,000 words on the most epic of video game genres, JRPGs. This is a guide to Japanese role-playing games, currently the largest book ever from Bitmap Books. At 652 pages, this has 665 descriptions for individual games or a whole series, from 63 different platforms. That's a lot of games, for more platforms than most people can even name. So everything from the popular Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest series to lesser known games like Lucien's Quest for the 3DO, Xanadu Next on the Nokia N-Gage, and that Samurai Shodown RPG on the Neo Geo CD are here. If you can think of a JRPG, there's a very good chance that it is featured in this book. The author is Kurt Kalata, who first encountered JRPGs by reading about the first Final Fantasy via Nintendo Power in late 1990. He has played many JRPGs in the 30 years since. His experiences, combined with those of over 30 other writers, have resulted in this book. Games from 1982 to 2020 are extensively described here. Not simply reviews, each of these write-ups are thorough examinations of a series or a single game, usually covering not just inherent features such as the premise of the game and its gameplay mechanics, but also the greater historical context, such as when the game came out, what the developers were attempting to achieve, and how the game compares to their other works or the competition. Oftentimes, the length of the game is mentioned, and even the names of music composers, showing an incredible familiarity with these games. These are not merely cursory glances like in many other books I've reviewed on this channel. Speaking of this channel, don't forget to like and subscribe. Showing your support keeps me motivated to keep making more videos like this. Before we dive in, let's take a moment to appreciate this gorgeous cover art by Stephanie Sabidlo. I loved the idea of video games being a whole experience that is much more than just mere entertainment confined to a box. I love the various character tropes that are common in RPGs, and that some of these characters appear as figures and plushies on the shelf below. There are games, magazines, strategy guides and the like strewn about on the floor, where the kids appear to be engrossed in the game. But the fantasy world they imagine has crystal shards and an airship, while 2 moons and a dragon loom overhead. I should remark about cover art more, since you know I love cover art. And this is particularly cool, perfectly capturing the wonder of RPGs. Stephanie Sabidlo can be found on Twitter as @DiceSMS. I might have to consider commissioning some artwork from this fellow Canadian once I come up with a concept. Our journey begins with some introductory overviews of JRPGs. What is a JRPG, you may ask? Why, thankfully, that's a title and subject of the first of 7 well-written articles before we get to the game descriptions. Though JRPG is literally short for Japanese role-playing game, which you probably would have figured out from seeing the book's title, it's really a subgenre describing a particular type of role-playing game, which, though many do come from Japan, do not necessarily have to come from there. This write-up talks about numerous elements seen in RPGs, including character stats and customization. JRPGs can be distinguished from Western RPGs by focusing more on battle stats and having more linear storylines, which make them more approachable, while usually having a particular style, including strong soundtracks and manga-style artwork. There are, of course, many variations and exceptions, and RPG elements are included in other games that would primarily be of another genre, like character stats in Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which is really what we know of as a Metroidvania. I do not consider most of the Legend of Zelda series to be RPGs, more like adventures, and while this book acknowledges that many gamers would agree, by the definitions that are set out here, Zelda games technically are RPGs, but only barely. A history of RPGs in Japan is exactly that, and begins with the 80s computer era, and the influence of Western games like Wizardry and Ultima, moving through the 8-bit era with the first Dragon Quest being a definitive game, as well as Final Fantasy and Phantasy Star, and so on, with many key examples through each of the ages, including the 16-bit era, the 32-bit era, and the PlayStation 2/Game Boy Advance era, because other platforms in that generation didn't matter much apparently. Then there's the HD era, and now we're in the modern era, where JRPGs are still popular, including the surprise hit Nier Automata, and very Japanese series like Yakuza and Persona now getting international recognition. On that note, the next piece, Localization, talks about the challenges of releasing games internationally, not just because of the work involved in translation, but overcoming technical challenges such as the compactness of Japanese text as opposed to English. For example, Chrono Trigger could only have 5 letters to spell out each character's name, which is why the protagonist, originally named Chrono, is spelled Chrono without an H in English. Because of this, and other structural differences between languages, it is often better to rewrite the text rather than literally transcribing word for word. RPGs tend to have a lot more text than most other games, meaning that translation is lengthy and costly, so sometimes companies skimped on hiring professionals. Games based on licensed characters from anime or manga that are unfamiliar to the rest of the world might get an overhaul, and cultural references that might not be understood, or differences in what is considered acceptable, need to be altered to suit the target market. So localization can often be about more than just replacing text. There are separate articles on soundtracks and anime, since JRPGs are often associated with amazing soundtracks and are also prone to cross-media adaptations. Then, there's an interesting, yet spoilery take on a particular trope in JRPGs, titled Attack and Dethrone God, an analysis on how God, or some divine being, may be a boss or superboss, and a look at the role of religion and the church in several JRPGs. In Japan, Shintoism or Buddhism are practiced, and are not mutually exclusive. These differ from other world religions, so some Japanese games have interpreted or appropriated religious figures a bit more loosely with little regard for blasphemy. For example, Mary Magdalene plays a central role in Xenosaga. Not all religions are evil or antagonistic in JRPGs. The Church in the Dragon Quest series allows you to save your game and resurrect fallen comrades. This is all very fascinating, and certainly not something you'd expect to read about in a book about any other genre. A quick 2-page spread on remakes looks at 7 games that have gotten a re-release or even a re-re-release. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. It's just a tiny sample of the now common practice of reissuing an older game for a later generation, usually with upgraded visuals and music, or tweaking mechanics and fixing bugs, or in some cases, more drastic overhauls, like expanding the story or going from 2D to 3D. These 7 articles are very engrossing, and I easily read them all in one sitting. Now we get to the bulk of this book, looking at nearly 4 decades worth of just about every JRPG ever. I said just about. I don't recall it ever claiming to have absolutely every JRPG in existence, but it probably comes close. It certainly has every major release that most people would think of. I remembered an obscure TurboGrafx-16 game called Final Lap Twin, which is the first racing RPG, which is mentioned as such in one of the 3 places that it is briefly mentioned near the end, among other games' descriptions, instead of having its own entry. The Paper Mario games after the first 2 games get a shout out at the tail end of the entry for Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, except Paper Mario: The Origami King, which is a mid-2020 release, despite this being a 2021 publication. But of course, the book can only cover so much with RPGs always being created and released, which is why Legend of Mana's 2021 re-release isn't even mentioned. And Bravely Default 2, from 2021, is mostly just acknowledged to exist. Undertale is here, but Deltarune isn't, though to be fair, it is released in chapters and only the first one has been released. However, Final Fantasy VII Remake is in the same boat, but at least gets a few screenshots. Many write-ups cover a whole series, so you're not going to see every single entry in those series mentioned specifically, like how the 2 pages for The Legend of Zelda mostly examine the first 2 games and then the latest main game as of now, Breath of the Wild, while only briefly mentioning some of the ones in between. This convolutes the actual number of games discussed, but at 665 entries, there's a very good chance that if you can think of a JRPG, it is in here, or at least its series. Each entry for the single games can be from half a page to 2 pages, with most of them being neatly on 1 page. The entries for whole series can be from half a page to multiple pages, like Tengai Makyu, also known as Far East of Eden, and Kingdom Hearts, each having 6 pages. There's a very consistent layout, with each half-page entry getting a screenshot and a very nicely framed, though small, box shot, and adding a wide screenshot for a full page. And the multi-page ones start off like the one-pagers, with subsequent pages adding more screenshots and box shots, as well as art as needed to fill the space. Still, it is a fairly text-heavy book, and since JRPGs are typically grand adventures with lots of locales, it sometimes feels limited visually. At least some care went into choosing the screenshots. Oftentimes the wide shot at the top will be of the overworld, and the smaller shot will be of a battle, or vice versa. So at the very least, we get at least 2 different perspectives for the games or series that get a whole page or more. The game descriptions are divided into 13 chapters. Some franchises are so popular and prolific that they get their own chapter. Other games are divided by type, like action RPGs or first-person dungeon crawlers. Or since JRPGs are already considered a subgenre, then perhaps these are sub-subgenres. The first of these chapters is about RPGs on Japanese PCs. Here we see games from the 80s and 90s, with the distinction of before Dragon Quest, circa 1986, and after Dragon Quest. Some of these early games aren't really what we would call RPGs, like Spy Daisakusen, which shares the Japanese name for the show Mission Impossible. It's an adventure game, but the packaging calls itself an RPG, which is all that it took to get into this book, or at least this chapter about RPG's formative years, apparently. Namco's Tower of Druaga, though an arcade game and not a desktop computer game, is nevertheless included in this chapter since it is similar in design. Interestingly, Square's first RPG, Cruise Chaser Blasty, and Enix's first RPG, Chiku Senshi Raiza, are both sci-fi games, as opposed to the usual medieval fantasy. There are some interesting games covered here, like 46 Okunin Monogatari, on page 45 instead of 46 tragically, which is the precursor to the Super NES game EVO Search for Eden. Then there's The Screamer, which deletes your save game if you die, unless the disc is write protected. Talk about harsh. The next chapter is a developer-focused one about Falcom games. Here we can read about the Xanadu, Ys, and Zwei games. Wow, they really like the end of the alphabet. Did you know there are multiple versions of Ys 4? The Dragon Slayer games are here, including the first game released internationally, which is Legacy of the Wizard for the NES. Then we have Dragon Quest, undoubtedly the most important of the Japanese role-playing game series, according to this book, which says that Dragon Quest established the JRPG mechanics and tropes that we know today. So of course the series gets its own chapter. This covers all of the main games up to now, except Dragon Quest X, which will be in a later chapter since that is an MMO. Of the spin-offs, only the Dragon Quest Builders series gets an entry here alongside the main games, as Dragon Quest Monsters will be in the Monster Collecting chapter. In the entry for Dragon Quest III, we get clarification about a supposed Japanese law about Dragon Quest games not allowed to be released on a weekday, to avoid disruptions from people skipping work or school to pick up and play the game. But, in actuality, there is no law. It is actually just a suggestion. There's a mention of the Dragon Quest Your Story CG movie that's available on Netflix. I recommend it, even if you haven't played Dragon Quest V. And the high Dragon Quest IX sales in the United States are supposedly thanks to actor Seth Green.
In Dragon Quest IX, I can choose from hundreds of outfits. I battle monsters in a fur poncho.
Since Dragon Quest gets its own chapter, it's no surprise that the other JRPG juggernaut, Final Fantasy, does too. Again, we have here the main numbered series except the MMOs, but this chapter covers more spin-offs, for a total of 20 entries. Here we get clarification as to why the series is even called Final Fantasy, as it's a bit more nuanced than most people say, and it could have been Fighting Fantasy. Thankfully for fans, this series had yet to reach its final installment, and here we learn about the diverse job classes, the fancy cutscenes, the epic stories, and how Final Fantasy VII pushed RPGs into the international mainstream audience. For the entry of Final Fantasy XIII, they say that Vanille is so inappropriately upbeat that it almost seems like she's suffered brain damage. Yikes. But overall, this is a great read, though certainly expected, as most people probably think of Final Fantasy first and foremost when they think of JRPGs. Next up are Shin Megami Tensei and Persona, which share a chapter. The 1986 novel by Aya Nishitani, called Digital Devil Story Megami Tensei, is about opening the gates of the demon world using computers. A Famicom tie-in started this prolific game series with 23 entries seen here, including the Persona sub-series, particularly popular worldwide, especially from Persona 3 onwards, and Persona is now much more known than the original series that spawned it, which for quite a while remained in Japan. Namco's Tales of series begins with Tales of Phantasia, originally for the Super Famicom, but ported to others. Did you know that the now defunct mobile version had save points that cost money? The series also includes Tales of Destiny and then Tales of Eternia, which was titled Tales of Destiny 2 in North America, for more confusion when an actual direct sequel to Tales of Destiny came out later. Tales of Symphonia is popular, and then we get Tales of Rebirth, The Abyss, Graces, and a whackload of places ending with IA. In the very large chapter titled Other Franchises, we see the rest of the standard JRPGs, the ones that don't have a dozen or more entries like the previous chapter-full RPG series. Here you can read about Star Ocean, Chrono Trigger and Chrono Cross, Xenogears, Xenosaga and Xenoblade Chronicles, Mother including Earthbound, the Final Fantasy Legends series as well as the rest of the Saga series that it is actually a part of, Lufia, Lunar, Breath of Fire, the 3 different Mario RPG series, Grandia, Wild Arms, Suikoden, Shadow Hearts, and so many others, including many one-offs and games that never left Japan. Games within a series are grouped together in sequence, but across the series and individual games, they aren't organized in a distinct order. That is, they're not chronological or alphabetical. But they do seem to still be grouped somewhat thematically. For example, games may be grouped with others on the same platform, like those for the Game Boy, original PlayStation, or Wii, and anime-based RPGs for Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon are next to each other. Games are often placed together if they are similar, like by story, themes, or level of bizarreness. There is a lot to learn here, since many of these games I hadn't even heard of, or had a chance to play, especially the Japanese ones that didn't see localization. Some of the interesting facts here include Samsara Naga 2 has the first save game slot erased when you finish the game. The Legend of the Ghost Lion, or just Ghost Lion, according to the box art with the 80s fitness instructor, is based on an English language movie released only in Japan, Pyramid no Kanada ni White Lion Densetsu, where the main character is played by Anne-Marie McAvoy of Full House.
Then let's go there.
Listen, this is very serious. It is not a game.
Square's Tom Sawyer has an enemy attack that resets the console, or maybe just the game. Either way, that's crazy. Doraemon Gigazombie no Gyakushu and Love Quest both ask right at the start if you'd like to participate in the adventure. And if you say no, both games end immediately. In Hero Must Die, the hero faces death and gets weaker and forgets magic as the game goes on, which is the opposite of other games. Dark Rose Valkyrie and Lost Dimension both feature random traders, meaning the game is unpredictable and different with each playthrough. There's a lot more I took note of that is interesting, but I have to give you some reason to buy this book, so I won't spoil it all. Now we're 2/3 of the way through this book, and it changes gears now, with a look at other types of JRPGs. We look at action RPGs now, beginning with The Legend of Zelda, which opens with the usual question of, is the Zelda series a JRPG? It does answer it by saying that the definition of an RPG has shifted over the years to the point where Zelda no longer qualifies, which is a different answer than in the introduction that says it is, but only barely. But what the hey, let's look at it anyway, though in only a short 2 pages. Then we get the Mana series and Kingdom Hearts, the crossover of Final Fantasy and other Square properties with Disney. Then, the Heaven and Earth trilogy, the name given to the Super NES games Soul Blazer, Illusion of Gaia, and a game that North Americans missed out on, Terranigma. There's Castlevania, specifically the not purely action entries of Vampire Killer on the MSX2 and Simon's Quest on the NES. And then of course the Metroidvania games including Symphony of the Night and the portable games that followed. There's the Wonder Boy / Monster World series, and Soulsborne, which is how people refer to Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Bloodborne. NES favorites like Phazanadu and Crystalis appear here. The Super Famicom game Gunman's Proof rips off The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, very obviously so from the layout of the overworld and dungeons, but mixes it up with cowboys and aliens, but the labyrinths are almost completely devoid of puzzles, as it's all about action. If Zelda being considered an RPG series is already a stretch, it is even more so to include this. But we'll let it slide because it's a fascinating twist on one of the best Zelda games ever. Strategy RPGs covers games including more precise warfare, often with a focus on individual units in battle, such as Shining Force, Langrisser, Ogre Battle and Tactics Ogre, Final Fantasy Tactics, Arc the Lad, Sakura Wars, Disgaea, Valkyria Chronicles, and so many more. I snickered when it said, the Fire Emblem series has shown no evidence of stopping, especially as Nintendo continues to add new characters to the Super Smash Bros. Games. Got enough Fire Emblem representation yet? Super Robot Wars sounds interesting, especially for fans of Japanese mecha, as it crosses over Gundam, Neon Genesis Evangelion, Super Sentai, and even Godzilla, Hatsune Miku, Cowboy Bebop, and others. I haven't played Growlancer, but it sounds neat that the first game determines your stats by how you behave in town at the beginning. The chapter on first-person dungeon crawlers includes games like the Etrian Odyssey series, a couple of Sega's Shining games, and Arcana. Interestingly, Wizardry is the first series mentioned. Despite being American, it has had a huge influence on JRPGs, and actually is more popular in Japan, and even had some exclusive entries released there, so that justifies it being featured here. I learned that the characters in the Puyo Puyo puzzle game series originally come from Compau's Madu Monogatari series. Did you know that Dinosaur doesn't have any dinosaurs in it, and it's not even prehistoric? Dungeon Kid is a Famicom game where you can create your own dungeons, which feels ahead of its time. The Shadow Brain cartridge came with a VHS tape, and the game features an in-game BBS, which was pretty impressive for 1990. But now, I don't think young people even know what VHSs and BBSs are. Japanese roguelikes are also typically dungeon crawlers, but have randomly generated labyrinths. This section is smaller than the others, but includes the Bizarre Baroque and the cute Izuna Legend of the Unemployed Ninja. And of course, there is the Mystery Dungeon series, which started as a spin-off of Dragon Quest IV, turned into a sub-series for other characters from other franchises, including a few with Final Fantasy's Chocobo, and a good number of them for Pokemon, which is the most recognized Mystery Dungeon series outside of Japan. Speaking of Pokemon, you already know that the main series games head up the monster collecting RPG section. Pokemon is well described in its origin and game mechanics, though it seems odd to not even mention the popular mobile game Pokemon Go, whereas other game series in this book do have their various and lesser spin-offs mentioned. The only mention of the Pokemon trading card game is in the chapter's intro, but not in the Pokemon write-up proper, and the long-running anime is barely mentioned. While I definitely, and vehemently, agree that Pokemon should be understood as firstly and primarily being a video game series, it still seems odd to seemingly skim over it being a pop cultural phenomenon, since the scope reaches beyond the games themselves in the descriptions of other games. Anyway, this genre also includes Digimon, Dragon Quest Monsters, Metabots, and Yokai Watch. The majority of these games are for handhelds, except for Jade Cocoon and Monster Rancher, which began on the PlayStation and PlayStation 2, where you can unlock your disc. That is, generating monsters by inserting music CDs, DVD movies, and other game discs.
Unlock it, claim it, you can tame it, unlock your disc.
As seen in this chapter, there's variety in catching them all, where them could be creatures, robots, demons, or spirits of folklore. And we're almost done with reading about them all, as we finish off with miscellaneous RPGs. Massively multiplayer online role-playing games, or MMORPGs, are here, as are sports RPGs, racing RPGs, offbeat RPGs, and Western RPGs, such as the American-developed Secret of Evermore, that can be considered a JRPG when using it as a genre descriptor, rather than referring to its place of origin. Big-name MMOs like Phantasy Star Online, Final Fantasy XI and XIV, and Dragon Quest X are here, as well as smaller efforts like Pure Solar and the Great Architects, a homebrew Sega Genesis game made in 2010, an indie RPG called Jimmy and the Pulsating Mass that was originally developed in RPG Maker, and the freeware insanity that is Barkley Shut Up and Jam Gaiden, a sequel/spin-off to the basketball game Barkley Shut Up and Jam, and the first Space Jam movie as well. And by including indie RPGs, of course Undertale would get an entry here. But while this book is generally good about avoiding spoilers, you'd think they'd mention, even briefly, the one music track that everyone knows, even people that haven't played this game. Its spin-off, the cleverly anagrammed Deltarune, isn't mentioned either. The book's final game description is of Moon Remix RPG Adventure, a game that inspired Undertale. There's no conclusion or wrap-up, just a 9-page index covering the 665 games or series covered, which can be handy to find what you're looking for, since the content isn't in alphabetical order. And so, this is a guide to Japanese role-playing games. Overall, this is very well written. The writers are very familiar with each game, and very thorough, covering many aspects. Recapping the premise is expected, of course, and game mechanics are often described in some detail. Also, we learn how well the translations are compared to the original Japanese, and even whether the soundtrack is any good, and composers are mentioned by name. Recognizing these individuals is not a common thing in other books I've reviewed, at all, and so it is certainly appreciated here. The typical lengths of playthroughs are sometimes brought up, especially if the games are short, like 20 hours or less. It's this deep dive into all the games here that makes reading this quite the learning experience than simply perusing a catalog of games. As much as I enjoy reading the encyclopedia-style books of entire game libraries, such as for the NES and Super NES that I've seen reviewed here on this channel, some of those books just have blurbs about games that don't sound like the writers necessarily played much of them. This book is a step above, as you can tell Kalata and his team have played these games, or enough of each of them, which is still impressive since RPGs can be long or slow to start before you can get into the swing of things enough to be able to describe them as thoroughly as in here. Though I love JRPGs, I haven't had a chance to play many of these games due to the amount of time involved, and mostly because many of these are in Japanese and haven't been localized. Perhaps because of this, there is very little for me to call out in a fact check. So, for better or for worse, I don't need to spend a lot of time tearing into this book because of errors. Some of my viewers actually like when I'm a critical reviewer and point errors out, so I'll do what I can. There is a somewhat grievous error that I found when I was nearly done editing this video. I was intrigued about how it says here that Monster Rancher for the DS has a number of ways of generating monsters, one of which is inserting different Game Boy Advance games into the GBA slot of the original DS or DS Lite. This would be very similar to using CDs, DVDs, and other game discs to generate monsters in the PlayStation versions, and there are a number of lists online for which discs to use for what monsters. Handy if you have an extensive music, movie, or game collection. So I expected a similar list, but for GBA games on the DS version. But I couldn't find such a list anywhere, and no one seemed to have ever discussed this. I expected that at least there would be a YouTube video of this feature in action. I reached out to the hipster Sneck on his YouTube review of this game, and he was good about replying back. He confirmed what I was now suspecting, that this is not actually a thing, despite being rumored. I'm not going to change the rating that I will give this book later on in the video, but now I do wonder how many other hard-to-spot errors might still exist in this book. There are a few minor spelling errors, and occasionally a missing word or an extra word here and there. Of the 30 errors I found, the vast majority of them are in the second half of the book, so perhaps the proofreader felt fatigued towards the end, or if there were two proofreaders each taking half, then the first one did a much better job. The errors are uncommon. Again, we're talking 30 in a book of 370,000 words, and most of them are rarely anything derailing. But for Linko Liver Story, it says, "The adventure is a little easy, and it's terribly long." But HowLongToBeat.com says it's only 6 to 8 hours. Did they mean it's not terribly long? In that case, missing the word not certainly makes a difference. Kingdom Hearts is said here to have debuted on the PlayStation, but it was actually the PlayStation 2. Then, there are some platform listings that are confusing. For example, Battle of Olympus is listed for the FC, as in Famicom, and Faria for the NES. But both games are indeed for both, and both had the Famicom version released before the NES version, so the platform listing really should be the same for both games. While not wrong as it currently is, per se, it is a matter of consistency. On the more pedantic side, we have specific errors like how in the Mana series, the mushrooms should actually be called mushbooms, and that Pokemon Conquest mentions your faithful Eevees. But all Pokemon species names have the same single and plural form, so it should be your faithful Eevee. Perhaps due to my familiarity with the series, I noticed other Pokemon errors, like how they said Pokemon rivals will choose a starter with an advantageous type. This is not always the case, as recent ones don't. Howl and Hop, in the latest generations as of now, choose Pokemon with a type disadvantage to yours. And again with Pokemon is the one non-text error I spotted. That is not the correct box art for the Fire Red version. The Charizard that appears here is from the artwork from Pokemon Ranger for the DS. There are many fan versions of Pokemon box art, and I suspect this is one of them. Given the popularity of Pokemon, and therefore the familiarity there should be of the correct box art, this error seems a little silly, even if it is subtle. There were a couple of things not mentioned. So, while not necessarily errors, they are curious omissions. Like I said about completely glossing over Pokemon Go, despite spin-offs of other games being mentioned. And also, there's Undertale. I actually recently played this game. Yes, I'm a little behind on my games. And I can tell you that pretty much every gamer, even if they haven't played this, knows about one particular battle in this game. Technically, being an endgame detail, it's a spoiler, which the book is generally good about avoiding. But still, to not even at least allude to the one thing that is so well known about this game, it just seems a little odd to me. Then again, maybe I would be wrong to criticize the text for only a couple of decisions regarding what seems noteworthy, since the writing is very well done. Top tier even. It is professional and well researched. This is over 600 pages of relatively small text, and yet it wasn't strenuous to read. I probably would have liked more images though, as RPGs tend to be long and varied, taking place across entire worlds, so 2 screenshots on a page don't feel like they quite do these globe-trotting adventures justice. But again, they are good at having screenshots with different perspectives, so I recognize and appreciate the effort in their selection. It's not always a given, as seen in some of the other books I've looked at. But maybe we can't really compare with those other books, as this book is unique. I haven't yet reviewed a multi-platform book covering so many games of a single genre or subgenre on this channel. I think this really showcases the love of grand adventures across the whole spectrum, whether it's retro or modern, on a computer, console, or handheld, medieval fantasy or science fiction, raising monsters or commanding soldiers, or maybe we like the flashiness of full motion cutscenes and the sense of power after grinding to build up our experience levels. Whatever it is that we enjoy about JRPGs, Kurt Kaladas shares that love and has put it to good use in assembling a book, or rather an epic massive tome about these experiences. I know I've used the words epic and massive tome quite a lot in past reviews, but this one truly deserves it. Bitmap Books, A Guide to Japanese Role-Playing Games, gets a 5 out of 5. Really, I think it should actually be titled The Guide to Japanese Role-Playing Games, because I'd be surprised if there could be any contenders that could come close to this. Anyway, you can purchase it from bitmapbooks.co.uk. Full URL is here or in the description, and each purchase also includes a PDF version for reading on the go. Well, that was a long review, but if you made it this far, you must think it was worth the time checking out this book, wasn't it? Hit that like button if you agree. I have reviewed numerous other books on this channel, so if you are interested in those and any other books I will be reviewing, you should definitely hit that subscribe button. Any and all support for this channel is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for watching. Why not comment below? What's your favorite RPG? And is it also your favorite video game ever? Alright, that's it for this video, so keep playing, keep reading, and keep geeking out. See ya.